All right, so I'm going to start by duplicating the sketch that I made last week, just because I want to keep using the sound for this example. So I'm going to go to Open and find that sketch, the keyboard sampler. And so I had a few different sounds in here, and I'm going to recreate the sketch, but instead of using keyboard input, I'm going to use buttons. And I'm going to use a couple different types of buttons. And we're going to actually create these buttons from scratch. So a couple weeks ago, we learned how to add HTML buttons into the sketch. And those are perfectly useful. You can use those. But we also want to talk about how to create our own buttons. And doing so is going to kind of reinforce the functions that we learned a few weeks ago. And it'll also give us a chance to go over different types of collisions. And collisions in programming are a good sort of topic to think about because it's how we kind of know when things are in the same space, and it's important to be able to use for all sorts of different applications, whether it's just creating a button so we know if a person is clicking on the button, or for more complicated things like a video game where you have to know if things are interacting with each other, and stuff like that. So that's kind of the goal of this example. But I'm going to start with my keyboard sampler, and I'm going to duplicate this. And I'll just rename this interaction 2 example. And let's call this interaction 2 buttons. And I'm not going to redo the whole preloading section. I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff just to simplify it. But I'm going to leave the preload section there. We've gone over that a bunch of times, so we don't really need to go over it again. But this is just loading the 4 different sounds that I have into memory. So we're not going to use the keyboard today. I'm going to delete this whole key pressed. And we're not going to use these animations for today, so I'm going to get rid of this section as well. So we're going to kind of start off from scratch, other than loading our sounds. And we are going to create some new buttons, and we'll use the buttons to play the sounds. And this is just an example. You can use buttons to do lots of different types of things. If you want to make simple video games, you're also going to have to understand how collisions work. So that's kind of the thing that we'll be talking about for the most part today. And we're going to start with some simple circle collisions. We already kind of looked at this when we did our functions. So it's good to review in a new context. So the first type of collision we're going to look at is a circle collision. Which uses the distance function. And so the distance function is going to tell us the distance between our mouse and the middle of the circle. And we're going to use that to compare to the size of the circle to decide whether or not we're inside of the circle. So we've talked about this already when we talked about functions, but we're going to review it again and create a function, and then we're going to add a little bit of code into it to make the function play a sound sample so that we can click on it. So let's get started. We'll just go ahead and create our first button. We're going to have a couple different types of buttons. So let's call this a circle button. And so I'm actually writing the function before I've created the function, but I know that I'm going to create it. And we can just start off with a couple simple circle buttons. We'll use a couple of sounds. Maybe we can use the shaker and the cowbell. And so we'll actually put those sounds as arguments in our buttons. So I'll have one button that plays the shaker, and I'll have another button that plays the cowbell. And so what I'm doing is I'm just passing a reference to this sound into the first argument of this function that I'm about to create. So when we're designing a new function, we can decide where the argument should go. And depending on what the button is doing or what the function is doing, you can, the order of the arguments doesn't really matter, but you can set it up to, since these buttons are going to be playing sounds, we can start with the sound. You could also start with the position and then add the sound in last. It doesn't really matter what order the arguments go in, as long as they match what we put in our function. And you might, the text function, the first argument is always text, right? Whereas the rectangle or the circle function, the first argument is the position. So depending on what the function is doing, there's different things where it makes sense to have that as the first argument. So for our circle button, we're going to use the shaker and the cowbell as the first argument. And so I'm going to start creating this function, and we'll add other arguments as we need. So we'll create function circle button. And the first argument that it takes is a sound. I think I can use sound. I don't think that's a P5. Sometimes when I use like a generic name like that, I get worried that it's already a P5 thing, so it's going to create an error. But I don't think it is. So yeah, it's P5.sound. Okay, so I'll be fine with that. So the first argument is our sound. And what we want to do is play the sound when we click on the button. So the first thing before we play the sound is we have to determine if the user is actually clicking on the button or not. And we can also add other stuff into this, like whether the user has the mouse inside the button. We can create like a hover state and other things like that. So that's the first thing we'll do, is detect if the user has the mouse inside the button. So we'll say if, and here we are going to need to know the position of the button. So actually, let's calculate the distance first. So we'll say variable d for distance is the dist function. And remember, the dist function just tells us the distance between 2 points using using the 2 points as the 4 arguments. So x1, y1 is the first point, x2, y2 is the second point. So we're going to want to know the distance between the mouse. So we have mouse x, mouse y, and the xy position of the circle button. So here we could just put in numbers, but then all the buttons would be the same. So that's when we need to add arguments, so we can have buttons in different places and determine those positions using the arguments of the function. So after the sound, we're going to use the x and the y position for our buttons. So for the first button, I'll just put it at 100, 100. And the second button, I'll put it at 100x and 200y. So they'll be sitting on top of each other. So this 100 goes into the x, and we'll put the x here to get our distance. And this 100 goes into the y. We'll put the y here to finish off that distance equation. And then the same thing for this one, we have the x and the y here. So if the mouse is smaller than the radius of the circle, then we know that the mouse is inside of the circle. So the size of the circle is the diameter all the way across, and the radius is half of that distance. And so we know that the center of the circle is in the center of the circle, obviously. And so if we're within a radius distance of that point, we're inside the circle. This will only work for a circle. It won't work for an ellipse because you have a different height and width. So we're going to use a rectangle to do a different type of button after this. So let's just show whether or not we're inside the circle using a different fill. So let's say if distance is less than, and here's where we need to know the radius. So we could add the radius as a third parameter if we want buttons of different sizes. If all the buttons are the same size, then we really don't need to worry. So I could just say variable r for radius, and let's say it's 50. Then we can say if d is less than radius, then we're going to fill, that means we're inside. So let's fill gold to highlight it. If we're not inside our circle, then we'll fill plum. And so now we can draw a circle using all of these different parameters to match up with our code. So we'll say ellipse. So we get x and y from our arguments up here. And then we get the radius from right here. So again, the radius could be a parameter if we want different sizes, but we don't really need different sizes in this example, so we can just have the radius be the same. So for the whole circle, we need to do 2 times the radius, so we'll do r times 2. And now we should be able to see that that works. And that works pretty good. We can remove the stroke because we don't really need it in this example. Okay, so now we have 2 buttons, and now we need to decide if we want to play the sample if we're clicking on one of these buttons. So we already know here, if we're inside the circle, we can then ask if we're clicking. So we could do this in a couple ways. We could also have another state, which is we're inside the circle and the mouse is pressed. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it. It depends on what you want the outcome to be. So I want to handle these states separately. So I'm going to add another if statement. I'm going to say if diameter is less than r, or distance is less than r, and mouse is pressed. So this is a new state, and so now I'm going to say else if for my original first state. So this is clicking on the circle, and this is hovering, and this is not inside the circle. So let's use a new fill here if we're actually clicking, so we can see the difference. And let's see, what fill should we use? Let's use, trying to think of a good color to go along with plum or purple and gold. Maybe blue. Might be too bright. That's okay, good enough. So we also want to play the sound. And so this is where it's going to get a little bit tricky, but let's just play the sound and then think about, we're going to need to figure out a way not to kind of glitch the sound out. So now we can just say sound.play. And so this sound comes from our argument. And so it'll be a different sound. It'll be the cowbell if it's our second button. It'll be the shaker if it's our first button. And both of those are just references to where we loaded the sounds up here in our preload function. So let's see if that works. Turn the volume up a little bit. Okay, so it works, but you can see the issue that we're having is that if I hold the mouse button, it just repeats it over and over again. So it's kind of like glitching. So we don't really want that. So there's a few different ways we could deal with that. We could add in another variable to say, wait until the mouse is not pressed anymore. But then we would need to track that variable, and we'd need to track it for all of the different sounds. So that would be a lot more data that we'd have to add. And there are simple ways to do that, but we haven't actually really looked at how to do those things. So what we did last week is an easier way to fix this issue. It doesn't really solve the problem necessarily, depending on how you want to look at the problem, but we can ask to see if the sound is playing before we decide to play the sound. So we'll put this sound.play inside of its own if statement, and we can say sound dot is playing, but we actually want the opposite of that. So I can put a little exclamation point at the beginning. So this will only play if the sound is not already playing. You can see that creates a problem where the sound does repeat if I'm holding down the mouse, but it repeats at the interval that the actual sound file is. So you might not want that. You might want to have to wait for the user to lift their mouse up before they start playing again. As I mentioned before, we would need like a variable to keep track of that. So we need like a new variable for each one of our sounds to do that. Or trying to think if we could do anything else. I think that would be the only other real. We could also set like a timer to wait, so you can only play the sound a certain number of times. But again, we'd need more variables to track it. So let's leave this as is. You know, there's some limitations, but it's good enough for the demo. So we've got our circle button. And so the next part we want to make is a rectangle button. This one's a bit more complicated, but it's the same basic idea. So any questions on the circle button? Okay, so let's make a rectangle button. We'll make a couple of those to play our other sounds. So the way that the rectangle button works is we have to know a lot more about the relationship between the shape of the rectangle and our mouse. So we have a rectangle here, and there's 4 different conditions that we have to know that our mouse is inside the rectangle. So if the mouse is to the left of the rectangle, then it's not inside of the rectangle. If the mouse is to the right of the rectangle, it's also not inside of the rectangle. If it's above the rectangle, or if it's below the rectangle, these are all different conditions where the mouse isn't inside of the rectangle. So any button that you've ever used on any computer is essentially using this same code to determine whether or not you're clicking on that button if it has a rectangular shape. And when it comes to games and other things that require these types of collisions, this math is what's being done like all the time to kind of figure out if things are running into each other, if somebody's clicking on something, anything that requires that type of interaction is using this basic math. There's other versions of this that use more complex shapes, but this is essentially what's happening. And this is it usually referred to as collision detection. And so we're just determining one point, if the mouse is inside the rectangle. There's also different ways of determining if 2 rectangles are inside one another. We can go over something like that if you guys are interested in trying to make like a game type thing at some point. But that's kind of the basic idea. So let's go over the code for that and add in our rectangles. So I'm going to start again with a rect button function. And I'll put in my last 2 sounds. I have the wave and the laser. And we're going to do a similar thing where they'll be the same size. We don't really need these to be different sizes. So there'll be a default size for the rectangle, but we do want different positions. So we'll have different positions. So for the first rectangle, I'll set the X as 300 and the Y is 100. And second rectangle, X is also 300, Y is 200. So basically the same layout as our circles. So now we'll do our function rect button. And we have a sound, we have an X and a Y. And so just like we did with our circle, we'll figure out how to determine if we're inside of the rectangle first. And so this is a bit more complicated, as I mentioned. So the first thing we need to determine is if the mouse x is greater than the x position of the rectangle. It also depends a little bit if we're going to default to rect mode, the default rect mode. But if you're doing rect mode center, then that shifts everything over, right? So the first thing that we're going to do is just ask if we're, on the right side of the rectangle area. So that first condition is if x, that's the x value that we're getting from our function. If the x, or actually let's start with mouse x, sorry. Let's say mouse x is greater than x. So if mouse x is greater than x, so we're just going to start with the first condition. We're going to fill with gold again. And if not, we're going to fill with plum. And let's draw a rectangle. So we have a rect at xy. And we need to know the width and the height of our rectangle for both our calculations and our drawing. So let's set those values now. So we'll say W for width, and we'll say 100. And variable H for height, and let's say 50. So now we have a rectangle XY, width and height. And so if we run this code, we'll see that it works a little bit. Our rectangles are kind of over. Let's change this to 250, 250. And I think those can stay the same. Or no, let's move these up because we're not using the rect mode center. I just want these a bit more aligned. Oh, because the button's also smaller. So we'll do 75. 1 second. Where they are doesn't really matter. I just want to kind of line them up nicely. Okay. So now you can see if I move the mouse over here, both of my rectangles are highlighting, right? Because all I'm asking is the mouse to the right of this x? So the x of the rectangle is the left side. And if the mouse is greater than that value, right now that's all I'm asking. So as long as the mouse is on this side of the canvas, those rectangles are going to be highlighted. So that's not enough, right? I need to add more conditions in here. So let's keep going. So let's say and, so we have a bunch of different conditions. We're going to put them together with ampersand. So we'll say and mouse y is greater than y. So that's pretty obvious. It's the same thing here. So now if the mouse is above where that y value is, we're not inside the rectangle. So if the mouse y is greater than the y value that we set for the rectangle, now it works. So this one, we have to go all the way down here. So now we're getting a little bit closer, where this one works only if we're in here. This one works if we're in here. But if we go beyond this area, y and x are still greater than the rectangle values. So we have to tell it where to stop looking, essentially. So we have to add a couple more conditions. So I'm going to add a new line. And I'm going to put these, the way I'm going to design this will make sense in a second because it's just going to be easier to read. So I'm going to put the mouse x is greater than x and mouse y is greater than y on two different lines. I'm going to add the second condition. So for the first one, we basically just have to figure out, so where we start is and we also want to make sure the mouse is less than wherever this is. And we know what that is because we know x and we know the width of the rectangle. So all we have to do is check if the mouse is less than x plus the width of the rectangle. If that's true, then we know we're inside the rectangle. So let's say mouse x is less than x plus w. And I'm going to put an ampersand here to connect to the y down here. We'll add the last section in a second. Okay, so now we have x is greater, mouse x is greater than x, And if we go beyond width, then the button turns off. So we're almost done. The last one's pretty easy at this point. Mouse Y is less than Y plus H. So now we have one button up here and we have one button down here that work independently. So this code is, you're going to see this if you work with any type of graphics, programming, games, anything like that, you're going to see this a million times. Again, this works. I'm not going to go through a whole example of this, but let's say we had changed rect mode to center. What you're going to see is this doesn't work anymore because the rectangle is offset. So here's my mouse inside the rectangle, but it doesn't turn on until I'm in this bottom right corner because we've shifted the rectangle up. So now that the center of the rectangle is where XY is. So if I wanted to change that, I could adjust these things. So I'd have to subtract half the width from X. I'd have to subtract half the height from Y. And then I would only go width over 2 beyond X and height over 2 beyond Y. And oops, I took out rect mode center. And then that would work again. So we kind of have to account for where the things are. But in this case, just for this demo, it's easier just to use the rect mode default. And we can move the rectangle if we need to, change the style. And then everything else is pretty much the same. Now we can just decide if we're inside the rectangle and the mouse is pressed, then we can change the fill. So this one is much longer. I don't really want to repeat this whole thing. So let's just go in here, and this is a new way of doing this. We're going to have a bunch of nested if statements. It's going to look kind of gnarly, but that's okay. We can now say if mouse is pressed, and if, well, actually, let's change the fill first. So fill will be blue. And then if sound dot is playing, and we want to change that to not true. So if the sound is not playing, then we'll say sound dot play. Okay, so now I have although I'm not seeing the blue. Oh, I need to put an else here because it's always going to that gold at the end. Oops. So yeah, this looks a little bit harder to read because I've got one if statement with 2 lines, but you can always click on these curly brackets to see where they connect. This one connects way down here. Then if mouse is pressed, this one connects here, else fill gold, and then inside here we fill blue. If sound is playing, sound dot play. So there's obviously a ton of different variations that we can do with this, depending on how we want it to work. But this is our basic setup. We could also add in the animations that we had in the previous example to go along with this. We could do that in our draw function or in our button functions. We could add some type of animation that goes along with it. But yeah, that's the basic idea. Any questions on the rectangle button? Okay, so I'll post this for what we're going to do on Wednesday. As I mentioned, we're going to use the rectangle button to create a slideshow, kind of like a PowerPoint, except we're going to make it in P5. And we'll use that as a way to present the idea for the final project. So you can continue working on the assignment from last week if you're not done with it, the keyboard sampler. If you're done with that, you can start thinking about the final project. Just come up with different ideas. Make sure, if you're not sure what you want to do, go back and look at the projects you've worked on so far and see if there's one that you'd like to, continue working on and add some more stuff to. You can also take a look at inspiration. So there's a lot of different stuff on here. Not all of this is made in P5, but they're all things that could be made in P5 if you wanted to. So there's a bunch of different types of experiments on here. There's also student work from previous semesters. So you could look at what other students have created in the class. Some of them are just titled Final Project. So you might, take a look at those. This is like a simple interactive comic. So there's a bunch of different examples here. You could take a look at those if you want to get some inspiration. And let's see. Yeah. Let me stop recording.